Hello everyone, today we talk in general about political, military, naval and commercial power in the Mediterranean and beyond between the 11th and the 13th centuries. This kind of, in theory, economy history video mostly, however, bent to a more evidential and especially strategical vision of this power manifestation. We already made lots of videos about, generally speaking, medieval trade and a lot about Italian-led, Italian-controlled traffics, the Mediterranean. This is a topic that actually unites in this floating space of the de facto the great Mediterranean lake, more even than a sea, many different polities, cultures, that I would say this period helped to evaluate in hierarchical order, and therefore not just in simply, okay, well, this was a period in which everything was simply united or there was traffics, cultures were in contact with one another. This is important, but especially to the degree you understand the actual relations and strength ratios involved. We could talk from one side about the Crusades, we could talk about the Italian communes, we could talk about Islamic powers, intercontinental trade, even more. Let's try to blend a bit all of this. First of all, there is, and again, it's a very generic, or at least general video, right? Picture this in the 11th century, the great re-expansion, especially the re-expansion of civilization by many degrees, but in fact by different ones, especially depending on the civilization in question, right? You have a great re-expansion mostly from the Latin Germanic world. You have actually the Byzantines too, right? In fact, the Eastern Empire reclaims Candia, Cyprus, and Antioch even, all territories that had prior been taken over by the not just the Muslims in general, but by the Saracens at sea. So actually we witness a maritime re-expansion of the Byzantine Empire as well that does occur in part also through the context with the Italians, and in fact at large we witness the cities of Pisa and Genoa restoring access, especially for Italian vessels to navigate, especially the Western Mediterranean. Right, Pisa and Genoa are the protagonists in properly the clearing of the Western Mediterranean from Saracen presence. We still have actually to make in-depth videos about this specific dynamic, because this was, even before the end of the 11th century, in fact, a great testing ground for crusading expeditions that de facto already occurred as holy military expeditions, right? There is nothing really essentially different, like during the first crusade from these other expeditions. We tend to think the crusades were suddenly invented by the Papa. That's not what happened. If anything, the crusades that we conventionally number for didactic purposes are mostly characterized by a more formalized guidance, at least direction, indiction from the papacy, and also like the comparticipation of more, at this point, more in fact developed feudal monarchies, at least later on, especially after the first crusade. I made videos about Pisa and Genoa. I made videos about the Byzantines during the 11th century. So at large, you can search either by polity or by century, even on my channel, and finding all the relative playlists that can show you, for example, in the case of, say, the 11th century one, all these powers in parallel, what we're doing. Concurrently, by the way, the Normans were wresting Sicily from Arab control. This is yet another important passage that witnessed as a prodrome, as a prelude, some attempt of Byzantine reconquest. The actual connection of the Normans with the secular Arabs to a degree. I mean, some during the invasion of Sicily, some Arabs were even allies to the Normans locally. There had been prior expeditions before the papal blessing for the conquest of the island. Then the other big theater was, of course, the one of the Iberian Reconquista, at this point progressing up to the Tagus River. All right, you have, with especially the fall of Toledo, the shift. All right, the Christians getting the upper hand. This is something that can be seen at large in the broader Mediterranean. The trade balance going in favor of the Christians, that basically start having more precious metals compared to the Islamic powers. This is also a broader topic we will discuss better in depth, because that passage is often overlooked, right? How we often start as if, there was one power from one side, one for the other. Even when they fought, there was no sort of in between, or it's as if they just came to meet them in this moment of heightened action, so to say. But in previous centuries, lots of very interesting things were going on as far as this balance was concerned. During this era, of course, there is the monumental Latin effort to free the Holy Land, which, especially with the First Crusade, marks really a miraculous page in the history of mankind, showing the enormous potential of the West in many ways. Just think, this is something I often recall, how for us it's completely normal that at some point, I don't know, the Greeks of Alexander or the Romans at some point took over the Levant, and they kept ruling there without any problem. Naturally, mostly for anti-traditional reasons, the Crusades become a problem for which, oh my God, why were the Westerners taking over the Levant? Why did they go there? They were fanatics. They had it was exactly the same identical process, driven by the same confidence in not just the Holy War, but in the imperial Catholic principles, both in antiquity and even before Christianity, in these times as well. So there is really nothing strange. It's just like the medieval version of the story, but in fact, what's medieval really in strictly scientific terms? It's the repetition of that European power display that for a while succeeds to in fact establish also pretty advantageous positions in the Levant. There were a bunch of illustrious structuralist scholars that were extremely critical of the, of the Outremer states. They said others were doomed to fail. They could not maintain and to depreciating the local place. Actually, when you look at especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, you realize that it had an enormous potential, that there is nothing deterministic about the eventual fall of Jerusalem, and there is always a very strong Western involvement in the East that, as we explained in especially our videos about Italian trade and banking throughout the Middle Ages, always shows how basically the West maintained the upper hand, the economic and not only hegemony on both Europe, of course, but the Mediterranean and beyond. Right, this not whatever happened in this enormous space effectively revolved around Western civilization, whereas we tend to see mostly like the East as some sort of power capable of projecting itself once again against the West with the end of the Crusades. And then the Ottomans arrived. The Ottomans actually expand from what had been essentially a Byzantine background, and it's more like at least European thing than it seems in many ways. And so we tend to falsify these perspectives without realizing the disproportionate Western power wielded throughout all the period up to this day. It's mostly stemming from it's a perspective mostly stemming from a defeatistic narrative of the wall. But we will come back on that also because Crusades did not really end, not just until the 18th century, but during the same Middle Ages, actually, they were carried out against, in Anatolia, even in the Levant to some degree. And there were always projects of reconquest of Jerusalem. In any case, the 11th century is really an important time that witnessed how actually advanced the West against any narrative of, my God, these were barbarians who were re-civilized by the Byzantines and the Arabs. No, these were already a fully fledged civilization that, if anything, was also successfully exploiting Eastern cultures, in as much they already knew what to find there and how to integrate it in a system that was already more ahead. We'll than that, and this is notorious. If anything, if you have an understanding of high medieval science, philosophy, technology, etc., but unfortunately, there are people who still think that, I don't know, the Renaissance happened because there were some Byzantine refugees arrived to Italy and suddenly, allowed for the emergence of Europe from the Dark Ages or something. And not kidding, these people do exist. The 11th century is really brilliant in many ways. We also made multiple videos, even recently, about the Crusades and how this, say, Western superiority was actually quite assertively displayed in this scenario. We tend also to, in fact, to miss the gluing part, like the glue that and the fuel that rendered this possible, as we tend to separate a bit too much, again, the idea of the rough Frankish brute who arrived, from uncivilized places and skipping the entire notion of the existence, not just of the fact that, of course, the post-Carolingian world was dramatically advanced at so many levels, but including especially the military one that, of course, is not an isolated thing from politics and society, but the highly civilized, urbanized, advanced Italian communes that are already there, actually way before the Crusades in the East, right? With their merchants, at least the communes form officially at the end of the 11th century, but the urban communities of the Mediterranean, especially the ones of the Italian peninsula, are already particularly ahead, and we often forget this sort of, in fact, sometimes even a historiographical hole in the fact that basically the Roman legacy in this region had quite prosperously survived in ways that are really sometimes the missing link, the missing ring of the chain to explain how the West did what was able, in fact, to do. In fact, when we look at Western European armies, not just we're looking, of course, at a broader Latin Germanic force, where all peoples like French, Germans, Italians, and etc. participated, but we also see the powerful fleets that the Italian maritime cities provided in order to constantly supply not just the same armies, but in fact opening further the markets of the East, taking over the various portual citadels at the end of the on the Levantine coast, at the end of the major Silk Route branches that, again, were already frequented by the Italians and would be frequented by them also after the fall of the Ottoman states, but that were becoming properly the arteries of this major intercontinental trade, reaching as far as China. The First Crusade concluded by the close of the 11th century. It was definitely significantly supported by Pisa, Genoa, and Venice, which provided ships, financial resources, and diverse supplies. In return for their contributions, these cities gained substantial privileges in the Ottoman feudal states formed in Syria and Palestine, allowing them to exert control over Mediterranean trade. It could have not been otherwise. This was really the vital lymph of these states, their connection, their bridge with Europe. If anything, here we're not going to explain what on the medium long term went wrong with the Latin presence in the Levantine hinterland. But it's already a big deal that these states were established in the first place. And in fact, I wouldn't see the thing in so much catastrophistic terms like, oh my God, why did this happen? And again, etc. It's already a big deal that it's happening in the first place. The aforementioned three cities, again, especially Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, these were the most important maritime republics in the era, secured rights to specific streets in these portual cities equipped with, so we're talking quarters, if anything, equipped with a church, well, oven, warehouse, and we're talking about, important structures and fortified say buildings and communities. In some instances, in fact, these were entire portual centers in key Syrian, Palestine, coastal settlements were, in fact, they were frequently allocated a dedicated pier, right? It was probably given by not just the Ottoman states, but by also some, like the Byzantines, the Arabs, probably an entire Italian ports, right, controlling the various facilities. If anything, the Italians were, as we explained countless times, the only powers that could afford a virtually permanent fleet, right? Unlike even the major coastal powers of the era, like in terms of bigger sort of regional states, that the Italian cities still weren't by this point. There were even certain inland cities that were penetrated by the Italians together, mostly with the rest of the Crusaders. I mean, the compenetration was rather obvious, as of course there were some armed pilgrims that were part, say, of the international expeditions and armies, whereas there were merchants that simply participated to that, because the concept of crusade is actually much wider and less sort of categorical than we think, but that in fact performed different functions depending on their estates and their background. In any case, this enabled Italians to conduct their trade essentially free from interference by local authorities or rival merchants. To facilitate this, they were overseen by their own consuls and governed by the laws of their home cities. We explained this also recently in the video about the Venetian army and navy organization that, of course, pointed to an increasingly advanced public and institutional development, unseen, in fact, by mostly in the mostly privatized, like feudal, say, institutions that normally existed in the Mediterranean and in the different lands, in the different hinterlands that faced it. The Italian presence in these ports was vital, as they served as endpoints, as we explained, for caravans arriving from as far as the Persian Gulf through the Euphrates and Damascus, or from the Red Sea via Mecca, transporting goods from the Far East through Arab navigation in the Indian Ocean. These goods included vast quantities of pepper, the most coveted spice, alongside other spices used not only in cuisine but also in pharmaceutical practices across Europe. There is plenty of connection with this. We recently made, for example, a video about medieval literature. We talked about Constantine Africanus. We talked about the medical school of Salerno. That was also incidentally close to yet another. It was actually the chronologically the first, and at that time most important, Italian maritime republic of Amalfi, that we also made a video on. Think about how all these words sort of overlapped, how much of these resources, both spiritual and material, were shared and worked and refined. There is, again, an entire world opening here that very often, especially as far as the intellectual, scientific, technological, literary and more fabric of continental Europe is definitely underplayed, and at least historiographically very well known instead. So it's looking at this period that we can see properly a blossoming, right? Not of a sudden rise of unprecedentedly, say, undeveloped places that had not known that kind of force, but actually much more of a continuity of a great civilizational legacy that Europe had since Roman times and beyond, that even like was sublimated further, right? Now, beyond the aforementioned trade goods, the various commodities over which, by the way, Italians established a near total trade monopoly. So, picturing quite concretely the extent of control over the Mediterranean, local products such as sugar, silk, jewelry, and precious gems were integrated into global commerce as a consequence, right? Italian ships also began, in fact, at least they began to visit more frequently Egyptian ports, including Cairo, Damietta, notably Alexandria. By the way, think about Venice, Saint Mark, representing, of course, her patron, that was her tutelar saint, whose relics were historically, almost mythologically, taken from in the early Middle Ages from Alexandria to Venice, which tells you already how, even in the mists of history, we actually see that Westerners were already very and continuously active from antiquity, really, to this very, well, Venice was a more recent city, but in general, like, part of a much older, at least in this case, commercial penetrative capacity in, like, even great centers of Islamic power, like, in fact, the Egyptian capitals could be here. And here, again, the Italian ships commanded significant portions of the spice trade due to lower prices driven by reduced overland transport costs along the short Qusair or Suez-Alexandria route. In these ports, Italians were granted the same privileges extended by other Arab nations. And this happened by force, by the way. The Italians were essentially blackmailing, extorting, in virtue of their naval power, the fact that without their connection, without their ships, that these powers couldn't, they would have been cut off from the major maritime trade. And again, it was enough to blockade a port to cause an immense problem, not just to the locals, but in this sense to other powers that would have asked those locals to open actually the ports to the same Italians, that in this sense grew richer and richer and more powerful in the process. That's how Genoese, Pisan, and Venetian merchants maintained a steady presence in Tripoli, Tunis, Oran, and Ceuta. So we're looking at essentially from the central to the western North African coast. In the region, in fact, the Italian traders called Barbaria, so the Barbary, that literally refers to barbarians, actually. And it was actually one of the most profitable areas since antiquity, because some of the most lucrative slave, ivory, and gold trade passed, as you know, through the trans-Saharan routes, right, from Black Africa to the Mediterranean. We talked also about black troops, like in the service of North African, Spanish, and even Sicilian powers that are partly connected to these traffics. But the Italians would literally, of course, go at sea, like in circumnavigating Northwest Africa, passing the Gibraltar Straits, arriving as far as, again, Guinea, etc. Like, you could find the Genoese there. So it's a type of presence that prefigures, in many ways, the age of exploration, and that occurred at the peak of the great medieval civilization. This is also a very interesting perspective, because it's not like, again, even in the later Middle Ages, Italian ships, admirals, and crews were randomly, in fact, employed, especially by the Iberian, but also by the French, the English monarchies in the Atlantic. Italian cities secured customs exemptions, set up warehouses. They further built up their quarters. Think about the Galata in Constantinople. I mean, they literally were cities within the city, where in fact these Latins appointed their own consuls, as we've seen before. So they essentially replicated the government of their mother city, provided, of course, this was subordinated. I mean, this was subordinated to the latter, which did maintain an important control. And again, in some of the most politically concentrated and cohesive power of the era. The Italian cities, the Italian maritime republic's dominance was aided, by the way, by the steep decline in parallel of the North African economy, which allowed them to capture much of the region's commerce. And the reason the decline of North African trade is, or at least the economy, is specifically connected with the Western expansion, right? North Africa had, especially Western, Central North Africa had played an important bridging role between the Al-Andalus, Egypt, even Arabia. Right now, especially the Siculo-Normans, but as we've seen, the Pisans and the Genoese as well, were beginning to exercise some veritable control over the coasts of Barbary, and starting to exploit the local resources from, as we've seen, their naval upper end, and not only. These ports were frequented not only to import spices and agricultural goods from southern Italy, that began at this point to literally export grain all over the Mediterranean. And this is one of the most important indicators of the trade shift in the High Middle Ages and the literal booming of Western civilization. You know that in the ancient world, Tunisia supplied grain to Italy, Egypt to Constantinople. At this point, Sicilian grain starts being imported in North Africa. And not only, by the way, it feeds the massive Italian metropolises, further countries in Europe. So it's an enormous granary for in the very heart of the Latin Germanic area of control. And these ports are also, of course, in North Africa, by the way, are used to export local products. As we were saying before, also to access from the western side to the Sudanese gold from sub-Saharan Africa. Notably, Genoese merchants were, as we were saying before, were active as early as 1162 in Saleh on Africa's Atlantic coast, where gold from Bambouk was traded. Pisans and Genoese were also active in the Iberian Peninsula, both prior to and following the Reconquista, also participating to the latter, providing with important strategic and logistical support, especially during the siege of coastal centers, right, by the Christian forces at the expenses, in fact, of the Islamic settlements. In fact, generally speaking, when these towns were captured, was probably a power-sharing situation between the Spanish and the Italians, as far as, in fact, as the local ports were concerned. It's an immense power. There is a rivalry there, too, that brings, for example, the Italians to keep on trading later on, for example, with the Nasrids of Granada to create problems to the Aragonese, and that were always at the benefit of these Italian maritime republics. The privileges obtained by merchants from these cities in Spanish ports endured for a pretty extended period, by the way. They weren't just, again, temporary because of the Reconquista. They literally mirrored that Italian infiltration capacity during this time. The earliest and most robust Italian footholds in the Western Mediterranean were, however, established in the cities of Languedoc and Provence. This is also a very underrated aspect of the story. The Italians were very deeply connected with the French at this point, or just with the Occitanians, but probably with northern France, that, as we will understand now, was, of course, the other major um, Western European economic engine, and especially in the northeast. So Occitania was pretty sort of a politically fragmented area. It did not have, it was pretty urbanized, pretty Romanized, but didn't have the same political and economical potential of Italy, so that the Italian maritime republics start taking over important areas, right? Especially from the 12th century, becoming hubs of European and Mediterranean trade, driven in part by major fairs in the south. We're talking Montpellier, Fréjus, Saint-Raphaël, Saint-Gilles. These centers basically led to the north via the Rhone River to the Champagne fairs that were exactly like that pivotal cornerstone of Transalpine economy, of the enormity of the great Atlantic plains, their enormous demographic and agricultural power. The Champagne fairs were in fact the Middle Ages' only international trade fairs properly meant, achieving this status through, however, Italian involvement in the final quarter of the 12th century. Without these middlemen, there couldn't really be that level of international economical projection. 6 fairs were held across 4 cities during spanning nearly the entire year, one in Lagny, one in Bar-sur-Aube, 2 in Troyes, and 2 in Provence. Their importance derived from the meeting of luxurious Mediterranean goods brought, as we've seen, by Italians, and high-quality Flemish cloth, which Italians in turn employed in trade with the Levant and Africa, which also shows you how European manufacturers were being exported to the rest of the Mediterranean, and again proving this upper hand at all levels of civilization. Let's reflect on this, because on Schwerpunkt we didn't talk too much about the so-called Islamic Golden Age, which is something that at some point we will have to do with the depth and mostly the complexity that it deserves, because you know that this idea of the Islamic Golden Age has been not necessarily wrong per se, but it is being aggrandized to an extent by some historiography that wanted to prove maybe like some kind of non-European powers to be. Look at how advanced they were, and in real fact things were actually a bit way more complicated. In that regard, there is no doubt again that the Arabs controlled the Mediterranean trade at large for an important time. That they had again the trade balance advantage, but let's say there is a difference between being a big power and a qualitative power to some extent, and again, any power is both to a degree, and especially in their peak moment, etc. But probably we have underplayed the role of Western trade in that and manufacture more in that also Islamic Golden Age. In any case, this later period, I would say structuralists, leftists, etc., like tended to, of course, in manuals to discuss a lot, because it's socio-economical history, right? So the big topic of medieval economy is, for sure, this period between the 11th and the 13th century, where basically every manual written mostly by people from that background will stress, look at how far-reaching trade actually was, how many spices, how many culture, but the cornerstone of this is Western dominance, into a level that, in fact, is while recognized at large, is not so much propagated beyond the merely economical dimension um, in this sense of Western hegemony. All right, but it's otherwise extremely crucial here, because you can't understand even the other great chapters of the year, including the Crusades, the investiture controversy, the rise of the feudal monarchies, etc., without in the West, without realizing how proportionally advanced these powers were compared to, again, Constantinople and the Islamic world. The growing Italian dominance in southern Mediterranean ports, so essentially in Islamic lands, created tensions within the Byzantine Empire as well. Although Pope Urban II envisioned the Crusades as support for the Byzantines' fight against Arabs and Turks, the dynamic forces unleashed by Europe posed greater challenges to the Byzantines than their traditional adversaries. As we explained countless times, the Italian maritime republics, and especially the Siculo-Normans, were essentially the greatest threat to Byzantine independence and integrity during this period. I mean, the Seljuk Turks are basically nothing compared to the Hauteville of Sicily. We made multiple videos explaining how and why. We talked a lot about the Komnenians. We talked a lot about, not too much about the Normans considering their actual importance, but we looked at the Battle of the Iraqian. We talked about southern Italy at large, and we will come back on the Normans even more specifically as hopefully soon, right? But this is a great play, a great game that any, say, passionate follower about the Crusading era will be particularly well aware of, right? How much hostility, antagonism, and distrust, betrayal there was between the Byzantines and the Latins during the Crusading era, to the point that at some point they allied themselves with some Muslim powers against one another. There were the Cilician Armenians, there were other communities, and there is, as much as there is this, by the way, veiled hostility and sort of overall civilizational change, and in this sense, in part, degradation between the Arabs and the Turks, the latter of which took over the system, but also, in a sense, fragmented it further, feudalized it, privatized it, made it more oligarchic. In part, as we've seen, undermining further, in fact, the Arab economic potential, for example, that had not been, however, so sparkling as, in fact, the Latin Germanic one historically, I mean, the Byzantine one to an extent. Now, to offset Venice's commanding position in the empire's territories, the Byzantine emperor granted trade privileges in Constantinople to Pisans, 1111, and Genoese, 1155. As you understand, this is not a great solution, because in order to oust Venice, you're actually letting in other Latins anyway. And in fact, this causes lots of problems that reverberate within the empire, also due to the clashes between the same Italians. In fact, all these privileges within Constantinople and its dependencies sparked rivalries among the merchants of the maritime republics, culminating in 1171 with an imperial decree ordering the arrest and confiscation of all Venetian assets within the empire. You know that Venice in 1081 had received the so-called Chrysobulla, the Golden Bull, by Alexius I. That was a desperate move, and there, as we've seen with the Battle of the Iraqian, times of troubles against the Normans, the quasi-collapse of the empire at that point, to allow for especially a naval power to shield Constantinople from the sea against the quite aggressive and intrusive Siculo-Normans, right? And Venice had historically had emerged from de facto, namely Byzantine territory. The Venetian lagoons now had emancipated herself already, was de facto Western power, but she, very strategically and masterfully exploited this um, embryonal connection with Constantinople, but becoming really toxic for the latter as well, right? Venice's further retaliation after this purge against her citizens compelled the emperor, by the way, to rescind the order, because this was, at the end of the day, what happened also overseas, that nobody really liked these Italians because they were, as we've seen, very aggressive. Especially the Venetians were really incredibly ambitious, incredibly shrewd, and very well motivated, disciplined, etc. And so they had this monopoly capacity to blackmail any government to say, like, if you don't let us trade here, we will cut you off from the sea. And so at the end of the day, there wasn't much you could do. You could cause these pogroms, you could confiscate the Italian goods, but at some point you had to recall the Latins in, right? Which also created tensions, as we were saying before, within the same Byzantine society, because the emperors were, of course, on top of power, leading from the front and knowing what were the necessities of government in order to maintain power. But the same Byzantine subjects at some point very much resented towards the Latins, in part because the Latins were actually much more entrepreneurial and autonomous and sort of, in fact, successful in them, but also because they realized that their own emperors were basically granting these foreigners incredible privileges. And this boiled over, famously enough, in 1182, resulting in a brutal uprising that saw all captured Westerners in the empire slaughtered. And the Westerners would not forget. So think about this, by the way, even in terms of what happened in 1204, because there is this narrative that's still lingering that basically the Westerners were just basically some terrible barbarians that just wanted money or whatever. But they were actually very successful people that were demonstrating essentially to be a more successful civilization compared to the same Byzantine one. It was thus impossible not to spark envy and contrasts. But in this way, we should actually literally see who was capable of achieving more, right? And indeed, this underlying conflict reached its climax with the Fourth Crusade. That, by the way, started with the best papal intentions. As you know, the Venetians there rigged things a little bit, but it also became an opportunity for the West. That's actually where a Latin patriarchy was properly established in Constantinople. There was a moment in which also the Ruthenians were coming closer to the papacy. It was actually a very important Catholic universal imperial result. Hadn't Henry VI died a few years before, he would have probably succeeded instead of the French and the Venetians. But so it was their their moment. The Fourth Crusade was carried notoriously to the Levant on Venetian ships. Importantly enough, everybody knows that it was the Angeloi of Constantinople that actually called the Crusaders. So it's not even like it was, okay, let's go sack Constantinople. That's not literally what happened in a linearly intentional sense. It was more like, of course, everybody would have liked to take Constantinople, but there was a very explicit invitation and promise, like of compensation for that intervention in the usual in fight among the same internal Angeloi family in the imperial household. So even there, whose fault really it was. Again, the narrative that the Fourth Crusade, oh my God, because again, I made multiple videos about how the sort of Philo-Byzantine sentiment is spread in mostly for memes reasons, not actual historical knowledge in the last decade or so, mostly through video gaming and also YouTube, etc. And what actually happened there is something that makes you really, at least from that perspective, reevaluate really what happened. In any case, there was also this initially fortunate event. If it wasn't cut short, at least in potential, that is the not just the conquest of Constantinople from the Crusaders, but the creation of the Latin Empire of Romania, right, in 1204. Venice at that point secured control over 3/8 of the empire on paper/parchment, because that's what was the deal with the Crusaders. It was about sharing in equal parts, in proportional parts according to contribution, the spoils of war. The Venetians could have literally gotten 3/8 of the Latin Romanian hinterland, and instead they decide to take just the main ports, which was an incredibly clever way that Venice was completely uninterested, like most Italian maritime republics, to create an hinterland at that point, especially at that point in history. And so the Serenissima began to control an impressive amount of territories there directly, not on behalf of anyone, but as proper Venetian possessions, including the Ionian coasts from Epirus to Morea, Crete. Just imagine all the hinterland markets that revolve around those coastal centers. Negroponte, major archipelago islands, Gallipoli on the Dardanelles, and Adrianople. So we're talking about Adrianople, as you know, it's just next Constantinople, and also in the Thracian hinterland. So for the first time, Venetian ships gained access to the Black Sea as well, which had been de facto precluded by the Byzantines at that point, because you know that the Byzantines, after the loss of Egypt, began to import grain from essentially today the Pontic steppe, Ukrainian grain that they could access to controlling Crimea, different ports, also in the Azov Sea, that passed essentially in the hands of Italians. Later on, not much with the Venetians, but with the Genoese, that were literally provided with these ports by the Palaiologoi to reconquer the empire, and in exchange again for naval support against the Venetians. The Venetians, however, established their base at Soldaia, that would be today's Sudak, in Crimea, which is also much more famous because of the massive Genoese castle that is built there. It is one of the most beautiful landmarks, in fact, of late medieval sort of military engineering, sort of Italian fortresses. And that, however, really gives you a dimension of the wealth of these republics, but also their actual power wielding. As we know, in 1261, basically the Latins were crippled by the Bulgarians just a few years after the conquest of Constantinople, which is paradoxical because they're the Bulgarians allowed for the Palaiologoi to, in fact, at least have some breath, and from Nicaea to gradually retake Constantinople, which happened in 1261. So with a simple raid, there were just a bunch of Cumans garrisoning in the city, so the Latin Empire had some problem. We'll talk more about its history. And the Palaiologoi managed to reclaim the throne of Constantinople with, again, Genoese assistance, because, again, without the Latins, you couldn't really do anything there anyway. So after an initial period of severe crackdowns, the privileges and territories Venetians had held under the Latin Empire were reaffirmed anyway. However, because, again, you couldn't quite even dislodge the Venetians, and so they could perpetuate that blackmail regardless of who was actually in charge. Remember, that was always their trump card. While Venetians retained strong influence in the western regions of the restored Byzantine Empire, however, the Genoese gained prominence in Constantinople, as we were saying before, with Galata, etc., and its eastern territories in particular, so that Genoa dominated the Black Sea, and the Sea of Azov, that, as you know, was with Tanais, etc., was one of the most important trade, so one of the most important markets for the silk route through the, at that point, also the Golden Horde markets, that, there were different branches against the silk route, and we'll talk more also about those policies in Western Asia, Western Eurasia at least, that were in competition, by the way, with one another. Basically, the Mongol Empire would, as you know, fracture itself, and so here we skip properly. Actually, we'll talk about it now, but that there was a Pax Mongolica that allowed the same Italians at large, but many other Europeans also to travel to China. Like the 13th century China was full of Europeans, of Christians, and this was due to the fact that there was this, at least namely, large unitary empire that allowed for everybody to pass. There wasn't any sort of in-between. Then in the 14th century things changed, but there were already sort of different potentates here and there that had some advantageous positions. Kaffa in Crimea was also very important. Was their main Genoese base, the one from which they could more easily reach reach Crimea from Constantinople, from Italy. And so all this was through coastal navigation, as you understand. So all these centers were very much like steps of a very wide net of routes, which also supported local trade. Imagine all the, for example, the Genoese. We've seen it for late medieval Eastern European videos, for example. They had an enormous interest in the political events of the Eastern European hinterland, right? Moldavia, Ruthenia, there was a great interference in those affairs as well, because they cared about the local markets. Were fairly poor, just like in the Balkans, etc., but they were still quantitatively something. So this is valid also for Venice on their side. In any case, through Kaffa and, as we were saying, Tanais, that is now the same as of, the Genoese controlled transcontinental routes to China, at least some of them, while Trebizond connected to Tabriz. So you pass basically from northern Anatolia to western Iran, which was in turn also a hub for Indian Ocean goods arriving via Hormuz, so the strait between Persia and Arabia. So it's all incredibly important paths, all right? And considering that, of course, there were the Red Sea ones as well, mostly controlled by the Venetians, that maintain a privileged access to the Egyptian markets, as we were saying before. In fact, in 1261, the Venetian Polo brothers set famously out from the same Sudak in the Black Sea, traveling to Sarai, that, as you know, was the capital of the Volga Bulgars on the Volga River. Proper, I made a video about the Volga Bulgarian warfare, if anything, and Sarai was eventually taken over by the Mongols of the Golden Horde. At this point, they were already in charge there. So important centers that had represented, also areas that were barely civilized otherwise. The probably important trade centers, right? This is one of these major riverways, that this settlements in areas that had never really known a full urbanization, basically next to the steppes, had emerged like in this medieval times, witnessing, in fact, the pull exercised by these other major civilizations like Europe and China at the same time, not all. So they passed from Sarai to Bukhara in Turkestan, where they joined the court of the Great Khan in China. And so the Polo brothers returned through the Khanate of Persia, the Ilkhanate, the White Khanate, reaching Layatzo, that is Latakia, in Syria, on the Mediterranean, before returning home, right? In 1271, these were all, especially like look at these Levantine ports already Italian controlled. In 1271, the Polos embarked again for China, this time with Niccolò's son Marco traveling via Persia. The 13th century also saw the rise of inland Italian cities whose merchants engaged in Italian Western European markets in a complementary role to their maritime counterparts. We observed this in different videos. It's not really like, I don't know, the 13th century brought to the rise of cities that did not exist before, that weren't important for trade before. But let's say that the structuring, especially of city-statal regimes, proper favored also through, we've seen it, the affirmation of the Angevin hegemony in Italy, and let's say with the substitution to the Germanic Empire, to an unprecedented level of economic prosperity, of commercial traffics, like provided by this sort of political alignment of the various wealth city-states. So this brought to merchants from Asti and Piacenza journeying, for example, to Genoa, that is just across the Apennines, basically, to acquire spices for re-export to Western European cities. Right, it's just like later, I don't know, Florence has no access to the sea, but becomes enormously important for international trade as they imported through other cities. In fact, even Flemish, actually properly textiles, and they had banking branches scattered everywhere. Made lots of videos about this, and they even began to import Flemish wools, techniques, and even Flemish workers to actually surpass Flemish textile, Flemish cloth quality in the Florentine production. So it's really an incredibly prosperous moment. If anything, in my videos about medieval Italy, I always, let's say, warn the audience not to radically separate, in fact, so the Italian republican sort of mercantile cities from the fact that these were all basically cities acting like other cities, except they were acting more, right, compared to other cities, and so they had a more central role in international trade. There isn't just like the Maritime Republic, there isn't even a substantial difference in institutional political essence between, say, a maritime republic and an interland one, right? So this categorism is really useless. We will talk more about communication routes across the same Europe that, if anything, explains really a lot of things in this power balance. Remember that, of course, Tuscan traders, even from interland cities like Florence itself, that did not even have, again, a navy and access to the sea, were active in France, England, Flanders. Florence was heading to become literally the richest city in the entire globe. In particular, the Tuscans were present at the Champagne fairs, but Italians, even from Rome, from these kind of even relatively secondary cities in terms of international banking, commercial activities, were present there since the 12th century, right? And these fairs became a focal point for economic operators across Europe in general, pioneering the balancing of international trade debits and credits. For inland city merchants, the role of bankers swiftly took shape. That's what really allowed for, in fact, that financial development, regardless whether you had a port or not. If you were merchants travel, right? But at this point, it's not just about traffic. It's about dealings. It's about banknoting. It's about, in fact, moving assets in monetary form, serving kings, princes, and clergy. We're talking about insane amount of financial power. We talked about this in the videos about Italian banking. In the case of the so-called Lombards, that were Italians broadly meant, was also the offer of pawn-based loans, right? This role expanded after 1225 when the papacy tasked them with collecting tithes throughout Europe. This is a very important evidence of how capable in this money handling they really were. I recently made a video about the richest powers in Europe, and not just, you see Milan, Naples, and the papacy together with France and England. But of course, this Western axis was all interconnected, and the papacy could simply like subcontract the tithes collection to these bankers, showing how deeply entrenched they were in their privileges across, in fact, also the normal lay and ecclesiastical powers of the land. This is something we should, if anything, in some more specialistic video, stress, right? How these private actors were actively, say, oiling the entire statal and institutional mechanisms, even of universal power, the major monarchies, the major powers in this sense. As the Campsores Papet, that is to say, the papal money changers, they managed the transfer and exchange of diverse currencies. Their operations soon extended to transfers, deposits, loans, and advances. With their available wealth, they fostered the growth of manufacturing in various countries by trading their goods and drove demand for the Mediterranean's luxurious products. Of course, this banking, as it's explained, was an incredible pivot for production, probably like manufacturing. This all stemming also in turn from agricultural production, surplus, etc. So we're talking about the very heart of European economy being tied to such exchanges. It's incredibly relevant how sort of let's say non-popularized this side of the story really is, how much it's often just reduced to, I don't know, let's randomly see how wealth existed in Europe, but let's not understand what was the power like laying under it, like how sort of international it was and how well structured, well advanced, very institutionally tied it was. This is a pity, because it would contribute to dispel how the myth of European, say, medieval, mostly the sense of medieval backwardness in general. The fact that the world was, I don't know, not in contact with one another. People didn't know what would happen around. Like everybody had some interest in here, and evidently most of the system perfectly knew what was going on. So again, it's plenty of different avenues to study in order to study and to learn medieval history. But this one surely helps in particular, especially when you consider the proper, again, the main axis, the main vital arteries of this specific traffics, exchanges, trade, and so on. So I hope that we will keep talking about these topics. Medieval economy is not my, let's say, my war horse just per se. In any case, it's the only way you can truly arrive to understand how the system factually work and how it it really informed the entire system, also from a technical point of view. Like, how did, for example, powers finance themselves? Where did they find money? Why was there this pervasive Latin capacity in the Mediterranean? Why is that, I don't know, the Italian maritime republics arose? Why is that, I don't know, the Fourth Crusade even happened, or why was it possible for this thing to go on? Like, if you don't look at the systemic dimension of this all, if you think this is some sort of scattered accidents that surely align for different purposes, as we've seen, somebody could do it or not, but indeed there was a very specific Western force behind this that must be more comprehensively recognized. Again, these topics are probably, again, they're not new on Schwerpunkt. We really discuss them rather often because I would think they're actually sort of the most important in medieval economics. However, we will surely enter in the depths of this under so many other points of view, because of course there is a provincial dimension, a regional dimension that also can't be sacrificed in favor of with this more comprehensive one, but they all in fact back one another, and they should be understood in tandem, right? That's what I hope to offer with Schwerpunkt, such again, comprehensive vision of the wall that otherwise it's a bit difficult to find, because until you finally get sort of the also the more in-depth let's say topics, you also remain relatively generic, right? But also to understand what we just discussed today, for example, if you don't make multiple hours videos like this one, it's a bit difficult to get anywhere with even the smaller one. So it's all complementary. It's all part of a same outlook, and that's again why I also have the channel to begin with. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.